You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. In many ways, the homicide of Barbara Innis was a clear-cut case. There were witnesses, a weapon, and a suspect immediately taken into custody. The complication? The suspect, Barbara's husband, can't remember the crime. 87-year-old George Innis had shown signs of dementia for years prior to the killing of his wife at their Bellevue assisted living center. His journey through the legal system highlights questions surrounding prosecution and care of people with degenerative memory loss. Seattle Times lead breaking news reporter Paige Cornwell covered this story, including getting to know Barbara and George's family, and she joins me now with more. Paige, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So this is a story that is difficult to read, but I think really important, and again, tackles these very delicate issues and difficult moral issues, frankly, with how we deal with somebody with dementia. The headline is, "A Bellevue man killed his wife. He has dementia. Now what?" And I would encourage folks to read it in the Seattle Times, the Seattle Times website. I think my first question is, Paige, this is an incredibly tragic and painful situation for this family. Why do you think they decided to talk to you about this?
I think they told me they wanted to talk to me to show readers how, in many cases, and especially in their case, they felt the legal system, the correctional system, all these different systems aren't equipped for people with severe dementia.
So it was something that they felt could maybe help others if they talked about what had gone on here.
Certainly, that was one reason. They said they wanted to hopefully prevent this from happening to anyone else.
So let's start with the basics. Who are George and who was Barbara?
George Innis was a brilliant mathematician. He completed postdoctoral work at Harvard. I looked at some of his PhD work, and I didn't understand a single note or word of any of it.
You're not a mathematician?
Not at all, no. And even I spoke with other mathematicians who said this is even beyond what I understand. He was very black and white. His daughter compared him to Spock, and he had been a professor. His wife, Barbara, was warm and friendly, and she loved planning parties and hosting parties as well. They were a classic case of opposites attract. They had been together, married for 60 plus years, and lived in Bellevue. They had also lived in Redmond and Woodinville in different facilities there. And in 2021, George was diagnosed with dementia. At that point, there were memory lapses, and he had difficulty with completing his high-level Sudokus or driving even, but it wasn't what they would consider severe.
And so they had been living independently, as you mentioned, in different parts of the East Side. And then in November of last year, they made a move to an assisted living center that's called Sunrise of Redmond, which is actually in Bellevue. It's kind of in that Overlake area. So what led to this move to Sunrise?
George had walked away from their home in Woodinville and had gotten lost at least once. He was found by a police officer. He was bloody from head to toe. They thought he had fallen in a blackberry bush. At that point, he didn't know where he was or even what year it was. So around that time, his children thought, okay, our parents need some additional assistance. Barbara also really couldn't use her legs. She was using a wheelchair. So they were hoping to have additional services as they went about their years. They were both in their 80s.
And Barbara is killed just a few days after this move. What do we know about the circumstances of her death? What have you seen in police reports and different records?
We don't know what happened right before she was killed, but we do know that they had breakfast that morning. They seemed pleasant. George made a joke about he and his wife having the same names as the Bushes, George and Barbara Bush. Everything seemed normal. Barbara spoke with a worker to hear about the Christmas programs they had. And then midday, workers reported screaming coming from their unit. They heard George's voice. They heard Barbara's voice saying, "Help me." They tried to get in to the apartment, but George closed the door. They called police. Police eventually were able to get in, and they found Barbara there, and she had been stabbed, and George was above her with knives.
He was holding a pair of knives. It seemed obvious that George had committed domestic homicide. What happened when he was taken into custody? What kind of answers did investigators get when they tried to interview him?
Even when he was first taken into custody at the facility, a paramedic asked him if he knew where he was, and he said Houston. Others asked him what year it was. He gave different answers. None of them were correct. He was taken to a hospital because he had some injuries himself. He was handcuffed to a hospital bed, and before that he had been read his Miranda rights, which he did not seem to understand as well. He didn't seem to comprehend anything that had occurred. He again said he was in Houston. He thought he had maybe chased bad guys or there had been some sort of altercation.
Because people asked why he had injuries, right? And he had kind of differing answers to why.
Right. Police officers asked him if he knew why he was there, how he'd gotten the answers. They asked if he understood what the police officers had even said. They asked, is there anyone we can call? And he said, I'm afraid not. He didn't seem to recall his relatives either.
Mm. How does our legal system typically deal with somebody who is not competent to stand trial, which it seems that George was not, and investigators who looked at this said he was not? What would the legal system typically do with somebody like that?
In the legal system, if there is probable cause to charge someone, that will happen regardless of whether they seem competent or not. In this case, that's what happened. And then if there are questions about whether someone is competent, they then go through evaluations to figure out their competency. And in order to be competent to stand trial, a person must both understand the charges against them and be able to assist their counsel in their defense.
So George is charged with murder in this case. What did you hear from King County prosecutors about the decision-making there and how they proceeded?
Prosecutors said they had to go off what they knew and what they could see, which was that there had been a brutal stabbing based on Barbara's injuries. And George had injuries, too, that they weren't ever able to figure out how exactly he got them. And they knew that George didn't seem to understand what was going on, but just based on the facts of the homicide, they charged him.
And so in the meantime, he is in custody. Where is George being held, and what kind of the conditions are there? I mean, for somebody with dementia especially, what type of detention was he experiencing, and what type of treatment?
He was in King County Jail. At one point, he was lifting his mattress because we thought someone was under the mattress. He was throwing his cane, so they took his cane away. He was also taken to Harborview Medical Center, still in custody, but he was there for 3 weeks to get treatment as well.
And so how does this proceed? I mean, you mentioned that typically somebody who is not competent to stand trial would get treatment, and the goal is to have somebody who then recovers enough, stabilizes enough to understand what's going on and to be able to stand trial for what they're being accused of. But with somebody with a degenerative illness, that playbook just doesn't seem to apply here. What happens to George?
Right. Like you said, there is no way to fix dementia or bring someone back to a place where they are not having these symptoms usually. And so one expert said, typically within the judicial system, we have someone, we take them to a facility, give them treatment, and then 6 weeks later, they're back and they're able to stand trial. That just doesn't work with dementia at all. So in George's case, he had evaluations. They tried to interview him over like an hour. They tried to interview him, but ultimately the interview only lasted 13 minutes. And based on everything that the psychiatrist saw, she said he is not competent to stand trial.
And where is George today? I mean, what has gone on in between last winter and now? Where is he being held, and what's the status of his case?
The case has been dismissed. He was deemed incompetent to stand trial. He was discharged from Western State, according to his family, and he is now in an adult family home. He is 88 and very medically frail. His dementia has progressed. His family doesn't know if that's because of everything he went through or if that's just the progression that would have occurred no matter what. But what he went through in terms of being in jail, being in these new environments, that certainly didn't help.
So right now, thinking back to what happened here, you've been talking with the family for months now, and I imagine they are trying to find answers and trying to really examine the steps leading up to the death of their mother, of Barbara, and how she could have been in this position, how George was in the position he was in. I think one of the biggest questions I have is why? Why does something like this happen? Is it common for a dementia patient to be violent? Is this something that facilities try to prevent?
George's case is very much not an outlier, but an extreme case. Just in the fact that it was such a violent crime that it did involve his wife. All of those things, very extreme case. However, when people have dementia, there is the possibility of aggression. When someone has dementia, cognitive decline, they lose their sense of reality. They don't understand what is going on around them, and that can cause agitation and aggression. So we have seen cases. One researcher I spoke with analyzed 105 cases involving long-term care residents where one killed another, and often they had dementia. And in several cases, it involved residents who were roommates. So this researcher said it makes sense if you have dementia and you're in your room and you don't remember that you have a roommate and someone comes in, you're going to react perhaps in agitated or scared way, and that can lead to fatal encounters.
You think it's an intruder, or you think it's somebody dangerous, yeah.
Exactly. If you don't know who it is, and in George's case, he had moved to a new location, you might not know where you are. That might lead to agitation for anyone. And researchers said if someone wakes me up in the middle of the night and they're in my home, I'm going to react that way too. And with dementia, sometimes people can't really use their words, so they might act out in a way that is deemed aggressive.
As the baby boomers are moving into their 80s, we are going to be dealing with more and more people in assisted living, a big wave, what they call the silver wave, an aging population. And it is clear from your story that the criminal legal system doesn't have answers when it comes to what to do with somebody with dementia. What did you hear from people either in that system or outside of it about what might need to change?
There are many thoughts of how we address people with dementia in this legal system. There are prisons or different correctional facilities that are more geared toward inmates with dementia, whether they have been charged with a crime recently or perhaps they've been incarcerated for many years. But there's really no sort of widespread thought of what needs to happen. We know that being in a jail setting is not good for a person with dementia. We know that they might act out and be deemed aggressive, but there really is no one solution for this.
You asked a question in your story, which is that you were asking, what does justice look like in a case like this? Did you come to any conclusions, or did anybody you talked to come to any conclusions about what does justice look like for somebody like George Innis, who likely has no idea still what happened to his wife?
No one really had an answer for that either, what justice looks like. One deputy prosecuting attorney said, in a case like this, it's tragic, but we can't seek justice. He's not competent for that. His daughter said, I don't have an answer. I just know it's been horrible to watch.
Yeah. Part of what's so distressing, I think, is that so many of us have loved ones who will go through this or have gone through dementia cases, and the idea of planning, the idea of early diagnosis, a lot of things that were raised by your story. Did you hear anything from George and Barbara's family about what they learned from all of this? And obviously, I also want to talk about the emotional toll of all of this. But first, what kind of lessons did they take from this?
They emphasized starting the conversation early if either someone you love has cognitive decline or perhaps you are noticing that you have cognitive decline, and figuring out early what could be the plan. And sometimes when you see all the different instances taken together, you see a fuller picture. But when you're actually going through it, you might not see all the different instances. There were some instances involving George, of him walking away that his children didn't know about. They also had asked the assisted living facility if it'd be possible for George to live in memory care and Barbara to live in the apartment. The facility said yes, but Barbara didn't like that idea. She said, I wanted George to take care of her.
She would say that George was like her legs sometimes. Like that was a comment that she would make because he, even in dealing with his dementia, he was still taking care of her with her mobility challenges.
Right, exactly. So she wanted him with her. That's not to say that if he had been in a memory care facility, which is typically more secure, geared toward people with dementia, that something else wouldn't have happened. It's possible he was going to do some aggressive act no matter what. But there's the question that the children have of, could this have been prevented if they had been there? And they really just emphasized starting that conversation early and having an open dialogue. It's scary, but the potential consequences of not talking about it are far greater.
Where are the family members at in terms of processing this emotionally, of losing their mother, of losing Barbara, and also losing George in most of the ways that count?
Yeah, you're right. They've lost both their family members in different ways. They have said they don't necessarily forgive George for what he did, but they want him to be treated with dignity. And they're very emotionally taxed by everything they've gone through, and they are frustrated with the systems they've seen and had to go through to ensure that George is being taken care of in a way they see fit.
They're frustrated with the criminal legal system and the way that it is, I guess, set up to handle this.
Correct, yes. They say it's not set up for people with dementia.
Is there anything you've learned, Paige, from reporting on this story, or any questions that you still want answered about these types of situations and what happens in the future?
I think one thing I've learned throughout this, I was looking for solutions. What state, what city, what police force has some great example of how to address this? But there's so many layers in our legal system, in our long-term care facilities, how we deal with crime that need to be addressed. And I couldn't really find one single solution. In reporting this, I found that there are no easy answers for a case like this.
Paige Cornwell is the Seattle Times lead breaking news reporter, and she followed the story of George Innis and his wife Barbara, who was tragically killed last year in Bellevue at an assisted living facility, and what justice looks like for somebody like George, who likely killed his wife, but is not competent to stand trial because he suffers from dementia. And I would imagine this was a big emotional, difficult thing for the family to participate in this story, but I'm also grateful, having read your story, that the family decided to talk to you. And thank you so much, Paige, for your reporting.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. By the way, this show is only possible because listeners support us. If you are able to give right now, check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.